Welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole
and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and we're here at the AusACPDM conference in Cairns, Australia, to interview world-leading researchers, clinicians, and people with lived experience
to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
We are back at AusACPDM in Cairns, and this time we are joined by Cathy Morgan, who is a Principal Research Fellow at the Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Institute and the University of Sydney. Welcome, Cathy.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. So good to see you guys again. It's been a long time, hasn't it?
A long time. It's nice to do this in person.
Oh, yes.
It's so good.
I mean, I know it's sustainable to have virtual too, but
something
I
nice
literally
about.
like to see people.
It's so nice.
Yeah.
It's so nice. And look, the episode that you recorded with us, can't even tell the time now, but last year, is like one of the most highly accessed, most downloaded episodes.
Wow.
And I think it speaks to the work, the team, and how relevant it is that people are interested, and I think that speaks to a lot of it. So today I'm very excited to speak to you about this because we've been following, we've been watching, we know this has been going on for some years and it's a huge body of work. So the title of your presentation today was Harnessing Neuroplasticity to Improve Developmental Outcomes in Infants with Cerebral Palsy, the GAME trial.
Yeah, the GAME trial.
The GAME trial. And Cathy, this is a huge body of work that has been, we throw the word journey around a lot, but I feel like for this trial it's been quite a journey, hasn't it? And
it
can
really
you talk to us a little bit about GAME and how it's evolved?
Yeah. So interestingly, when I was doing my PhD, I did it on this topic of GAME, and I was really passionate about, now that we know we can detect children early, why aren't we doing that?
Yes.
And what kinds of intervention parameters should we be using to help these kids do their best?
Yeah.
I was pretty passionate about task-specific training and the whole motor learning approach from my background, and so developed GAME during my PhD, and then I was fortunate enough, along with my colleagues from CP Alliance and across Australia actually, to get an NH and MRC grant to run a really big study.
Yeah.
And so we started, we put the grant in 2016, and we started the study halfway through 2017. So between then and then we finished data collection in the middle of 23.
Yep.
Wow.
And so that was a really long time, and a lot of things happened between 2017 and 2023.
Sure
What
did.
comes to mind is you were collecting data during the pandemic, I gather. Like that was right in the middle. How did that impact things for you guys?
It impacted it a lot. I mean, it was a big shock to start with, I guess, for everybody, but we really had to try and pivot, like a lot of people doing clinical trials at the time.
Yeah.
So we just had to follow protocols, like everyone. And of course, most of the children who were enrolled in the study were in New South Wales and Victoria. They were the highest kind of recruiting sites, and we also had the longest lockdowns. And so we just needed to change things up around assessment. So that did mean that I've calculated about 69% of the children were in the trial for some portion of the COVID pandemic.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Okay.
Not for all of it, like some were finishing, some were starting, and then they were fine for later. But, it did affect the majority of kids in some way.
Yeah.
Of course, doing assessments online can be really tricky. We couldn't do the Bailey, we couldn't do the Hine. So we got a lot of late data and some missing data. But for the primary outcome, which was the Peabody, we worked out a way to post packs to families.
That's amazing.
And give them a sort of heads up, can you find a ball, can you find a rattle, or whatever it were. And then we had those assessments blind scored as well. Yeah. So, look, it's not as ideal, but we all had to just live with the moment.
That's
and
right.
I think we learned a lot about telehealth during that time.
Yes.
And, parents really did have to engage with what their child was doing. So I think probably from the usual care point of view, if they weren't as used to doing that, I mean, GAME was all about that, but it sort of brought the two groups closer together. So I feel like that could have had an impact as well. But we did try to get some data about COVID, but it was hard for people to respond during that time because it was just so hard.
A lot going on.
But there's a lot of healthcare at the moment that resembles a lot of the times that we had during COVID. So there'd be learnings from that sort of extends beyond and in unexpected ways. We wouldn't have thought to have done that. But I'm curious about just the actual intervention, being GAME and the comparison group and how they were different.
Yeah. So that was, I'll tell you what GAME is first, just for those people who don't really know. First of all, game has sort of three components that work together in a really strong synergy, and you don't really divide them. So first of all, we have a motor training component, which is very much customised to the child and based on the goals that the family come up with. So that's a really important part. And then the second part is enrichment, and by that we mean thinking about cognition, motor, social, sensory stimulation, I guess, that's going on in the child's life, but also the background for learning, because we know that kids who are sleep deprived, have got a poor nutrition, are in pain, have parents who are really struggling. All of these children are more vulnerable, and so we wanted to pay attention to the background for learning. So when I say enrichment, I mean specifically doing things to help across the different developmental areas, but also thinking about that background for learning that child is living in. And from the enrichment point of view, we also visited home. So all the study in game, every visit was at home. And then for the parent coaching part, we took an approach where we worked together with the parent to make them feel empowered to have choice about what they practice with their child and how they practice with their child, but also to build up their confidence that they could do it. And so really helping parents understand that they are the expert in their child. We're physios and OTs who worked on this program, and we bring expertise for sure, but we don't bring the expertise about their baby. And we wanted to help parents to really understand that they were in charge. You know? And so they're the three parts. I would say that in usual care, because we have looked at usual care in detail, and I didn't get to talk about that today, but there's a lot of really good things going on in usual care. And, for example, we found that 95% of infants in usual care had goals that were collaboratively set. Right? So that's wonderful.
It's incredible. It is.
It's really great. And then when we looked at the enrichment side of things, 65% were talking about having cue-based care as part of their approach. Fantastic. Like us, over 75% were doing intentional reading and other enrichment activities like that. I would say there were a few differences. So we looked at some passive kind of questions within the parent questionnaire, and we did find that over 50% were having sort of nappy change exercises and passive range of motion as well. And so, of course, that's not a part of game. And so there were a few differences. They were more likely to use like a traditional therapy equipment like exercise balls and things like that to roll babies on. We didn't do any of that in game either. However, there was just, I think that the two interventions were probably closer than we anticipated when we powered the study. And a lot of kids were doing, even if they had those passive things, it wasn't solely that. They did a lot of active practice of tasks, which is fantastic. 45% had home visits.
Wow.
So it was
hard
kind
to tease out all the different influences there.
It is. And, when we got the grant and we had the first rebuttal, the NH and MRC said to us, the biggest risk for your study is contamination between the groups. And so we worked really hard to try to keep sort of the game approach a little bit, confidential. We didn't share the manual. We tried to as much as we could, but we did write a guideline during that time. And, people are doing great work out there, and it was actually really nice to see.
I was going to say, that was what stood out to me in abstract was that, how close the usual care group was. But I think, there's positives in that for what that means for, of course, the children and the services they're accessing more broadly.
And I guess it reflects the Australian context really well. Whether that is the same elsewhere will be incredibly interesting, wouldn't it? In terms of different models of care. And
look, I have to say that more than half of the kids in usual care were actually attending Cerebral Palsy Alliance. So CP-specific service, and they do a good job. And, we've influenced what happens there over many years. And I know some of them attended your practice too, Dana. And some of them were seeing other really evidence-based intervention practices around the country. So that's great.
Was there anything that surprised you in the results? It's obviously a long data collection period, and then I know you're still working through lots of the analyses for the study because, it's such a rich data set that you have for these children. Is there anything that's come up so far that's been surprising to you or unexpected?
Well, let's address the no between group difference on the intention to treat, because everybody sort of expected me to be gutted about that. And I guess there's a level of disappointment, but by the same token, 73% of the kids actually were GMFCS 1 or 2, so are going to be ambulant anyway. And most of them were having quite an active, enriched experience with their early intervention. So it sort of tells us something that if those ingredients are there, they're probably going to do pretty well.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
I think I was surprised by the caregiver education piece. I don't know if you picked that up in the presentation, but for those families where education was lower, so and that was the group that sort of hadn't finished high school. Their kids had better behavioural, social, emotional outcomes, and we worked hard with parents around that to some extent. But we were, with physios and OTs, we had a lot of input from Cole Whittingham, psychologists, and other really clever people. But I was actually so chuffed that the most vulnerable children benefited the most, and that was the same for low socioeconomic and the more severe kids. And I think we often see, the Hemis do really well, but kids with GMFCS, 3 to 5 struggle more. Whereas we have the opposite in terms of function and competence. And that was a surprise, but I was also really happy about that.
A pleasant surprise.
I think that's that's a wonderful result when you think about, we talk about a lot, health equity, and when you're thinking about making sure our interventions are available to everyone. And what I would love to be able to actually point out here is that you are first and foremost a researcher. And I think when you go about doing a study, you have your hypotheses, and if you conduct it well and you report it with complete transparency, that is something huge already as well in terms of knowing where the knowledge is. Because I remember someone, when I was first entering research, it's like, you're a clinician, you've got to be really careful. You'll have your own personal preferences for things, but you're a scientist first. Follow the data, and that will tell you so much truth. And there's so much truth in this already.
It's so important.
Isn't it? And that just preserves the role of us as researchers when you're talking about, when we're saying something, there is value in what we're saying because we're able to critique and we're able to report
and we need
results.
to be able to do that. And you can't be so attached to your preferences that you're not really ready to look at the science. I think that's really good. I think I've been steeped in that a lot with where I work.
Of course.
And I think that's been a helpful process for me to sort of go through and think about as well.
It's so important. I asked you a question during your presentation today about knowledge translation, and I loved your answer about it. I thought that's worth talking about because of course, you've already thought about it. You're many, many steps ahead. What are the plans at the moment for this? Because you have, like you said, you've got a manual, you have trained therapists, high fidelity, you've done a lot of that. How are you going to use that? And what's the next steps, I guess?
So I think we, Iona Novak and I worked on this together, and we've sort of talked a lot about where we're going to go next. I think it's really important for clinicians not to feel they have to have game training in order to be able to do this kind of work. That's really important. Having said that, I think people do struggle sometimes to understand what does task-specific training look like with a baby. How does constraint fit into this? What is the difference between bimanual constraint and task-specific training? If you've got a child with a Hemi in front of you, how do you know which one to choose? And I think the principles of the guideline really, they came from a lot of people's work together, and they were applied in the GAME trial. So I think we could probably build some workshops that went into a bit more detail about the content of GAME, but I also think that guideline could be expanded in terms of more modules. And so what we're doing at CP Alliance is producing some e-learning in the 0 to 2 age range. And I mentioned, I think, in my answer earlier that we're going to talk about a lot of different interventions and approaches and topics, but we can't do like a whole day training on constraint, for example. So people will find it a principles kind of driven e-learning modules to get sort of some things under your belt. There's a lot of extra learning you can go to. Task-specific training will be a big portion of it, and I think I've worked out that we're going to probably have a general principles modules, and then one around sitting, one around reaching, one around grasp, one about uprightness. And so there'll be a lot on task-specific training. And I think that's the biggest gap, to be honest, that needs filling. I think you can get a lot of really good training on a bunch of other topics.
We've talked about it offline many times before, Cathy. And when we talk about task specificity, it's interpreted differently by different people. And different biases based on what you've been trained in. And it's incredible when we say task specific, I feel like I know what that is, but I have been around researchers and clinicians who we've gone to a lot of trouble to try to find what it is, but actually showing what it looks like.
Exactly.
You know, is sitting doesn't mean that my hands are here or here. Well, what do I do? Do I let them fall? Do I catch them each time? That's task specificity still, right?
It is. Yeah. So, I mean, I try to give examples when people ask me, what do I really mean?
Yes.
And I would say, always give an example of sitting. So if a family had a goal that they wanted their child to be able to sit on the floor and play with their siblings, I would practice sitting on the floor. Hopefully with their siblings. They may be at school or somewhere else, but we would start with that. We would put them on a ball or on a roller, and at the same time as saying that, there are going to be some kids who never develop the ability to sit. So then we're going to talk about that and what that might mean, what's stopping them achieving that, and think of another solution that still meets the goal somehow.
Because you've incorporated the cognition part there. It's not just sitting for sitting's sake, it's sitting within context. And context is cognition, it's communication and play.
Children don't sit because we've written a goal.
No.
They sit because they want to play. Right?
And interact.
It's really important to think about what's happening for the child in all these moments.
I feel like this ties in beautifully to, we were talking to Stacey Dusing before about professional development, and there's some opportunities and implementation of principles rather than the really prescriptive kind of programs that you see sometimes that perhaps aren't evidence-based. We know we're very confident in the guidelines and the evidence behind those guidelines, but I feel like this is that's a really beautiful next step in making sure that people are as clear on how to implement those as they can be.
That's right. Exactly. And how to work with parents, I think, is so important, because we had a really strong approach in the Game Child to not let children be crying during therapy, and we stopped when they were. And we problem solved with parents, and some kids are more dysregulated than others, and maybe those kids aren't going to get as much motor practice while they work on learning to manage their emotions. And that's fine. I'm a physio saying that. If they take longer than I thought their potential was to get on their feet, that's okay. If their parent relationship is intact, and they're feeling safe and they're feeling comfortable. So there's a lot to think about in how we work with these really vulnerable kids.
And I think this is second nature to you, but I think it has been a very significant shift. Even the time I've been a physio, 20 years, it's shifted a lot during that time. But to even say that, to go, look, we're not going to push past crying because that matters. Parent relationships, that matters. And that child having a voice, that absolutely matters as well. And like you said, it's a physio saying this. We're not just powering through and go, let's go milestone, tick, 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 tick.
Exactly.
It's more than that.
People are more than their sitting ability or their standing ability.
And
we have to remember that.
That's beautiful.
Love that.
Kathy, that was brilliant. Thank you. That was just, it's such a great way to, the study in itself, just the way it defines the principles, the fidelity that it was carried out under, the kind of outcome measures that you use, so useful in clinical practice. So thank you for doing the work.
It's my pleasure.
So exciting to see where it's going to head.
We know you have lots more to, that will come out of this program of work. So we're really excited to see and hear about those, and hope you come back and share them with us.
Thank you, guys. I do love talking about this topic, so thanks for inviting me. It's been fun.
We love talking to you about it. So
that's right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So to all of our listeners, I hope you enjoyed that as much as we did. But there's so much more to come. So stay tuned. Thanks and bye.
Bye.